that now. I'm going to record the meetings and I'll upload the videos to my website, aplanelife.us, which you've all visited. That's how you got the link. It'll be in the video section. So you can go back and replay the video and review it at any time. It'll probably be unedited. It'll just be raw video uploaded. So it'll run as long as this runs. But it'll be there for a resource for you to go back to. All the meetings are on Saturday at 10 o'clock. Like I said, there's 3 of them. I've broken this into 3 sections covering giving the supplies and prepping a plane, mixing Japanning, and then applying and curing Japanning. So I've had people ask me, why not just do a YouTube video? I don't know anybody that wants to watch a 3-hour YouTube video, and that's kind of what it takes, I think, to really give you a in-depth information on how to do this so you can be successful. There are some YouTube videos out there on Japanning. They're pretty good. They're pretty brief. Hey, I watched some of those and that helped me get started some time ago. But there are a lot of details that they don't cover. I'm going to try to make it easy for you so you don't run into the same mistakes that I ran into. So any questions before we begin? I'm going to go out of this speaker view thing here so I can see everybody. And just unmute yourself if you have a question before we get started. Okay, well, that being the case, let's dive in. Here we go. So the whole reason I'm doing this is I just want to demystify Japanning and being able to restore Japanning on people's hand planes. It's not a difficult process, but it's hard to find information out there. I think it's hard to find really thorough information. It's tough learning from your own mistakes. So I just try to help folks be successful from the start. There's no formal training for antique hand plane Japanning. I didn't go to any kind of a school for this, but certainly there's information out there at YouTube University and Google, but hopefully you'll find this thorough enough that you'll be successful. I've done this before and we've had a number of people successfully Japanning their hand planes, so it seems to work. The concept behind this was to be kind of a walkthrough where we'll cover information, and then in the following week, you can go and apply that to the project you're working on step by step. And then so like in week 2, when we're mixing Japanning, you can then, take your supplies and mix your Japanning. That's the concept. Obviously, you don't have to work along with us. You can just listen to the information and then tackle it whenever you're ready. But that's kind of why I structured it with 1 meeting a week. So people could kind of apply what they're learning as they go. Yes?
Facebook feed?
No.
Not working?
I'm not doing Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Welcome to my shop. Okay, a little background on myself. I've been a hobbyist woodworker, mostly machine tools, for about 40 years. Started collecting hand planes when I stumbled across my grandfather's old hand plane, like many of you, and cleaned it up, restored it. I own over 200 planes now. I've restored lots of planes for myself and for others. I pretty much own just about every brand that's out there. I kind of like the hardware store brand hand planes, which means they were made by somebody else. So in my collection of mostly Sears hardware planes, it's kind of what I like. There's Stanley's, Sargent's, Ohio's, Unions, everything's in there. So, like yourself, wanted to clean them up, get all the rust off, make them look nice, put them back to work. Started out like most people with some planes that I put the rattle can finish on, and that looked great, but it's not very durable. I wasn't very happy with it, and so I decided to look into this Japanning thing and figure out how to do it. So, yeah, why Japan? Why not just spray paint them? Hey, it's your plane. You can do whatever you want. I have no objections to folks that paint them. I've got a very good friend of mine who restores Stanley planes. He's probably the finest restorer there is out there to give you to produce a user plane. And he puts a multi-part enamel finish on them, and they look fantastic. He's done a plane for me, and they're beautiful. But you know, I wanted to be a little bit more historically correct on the planes. So the ones that were made, you know, pre 1935 are mostly all Japan. And so I typically Japan those. Some of the planes I know were originally enameled. I still enamel them. But I do find the Japanning is more durable than enamel. It doesn't chip as easy. It's a thicker coating. And I think to me, it's easier to apply. I got pretty tired of masking off all the little bits and pieces of a block plane to spray it. And with Japanning, you don't have to mask. It's real easy to brush on. It's real easy to brush and move the material around the areas you don't want it on. And if you get the liquid Japanning on something you don't want it on, you just take a rag and wipe it off before you heat cure it and keep going. So I find it to be a lot easier and faster than enameling planes. So I prefer to Japan. From there, just real quick, a little bit of background on Japanning. The term really comes from Japan lacquerware, which was an artist's finish that originated in Japan a long, long time ago. There's evidence of this going back as far as 9,000 BC, but in the 1300s, 1400s, artisans in Japan were finishing woodwork with Japanning, with a lacquer type finish or a paint type finish. It became very popular in Europe. They were importing this into Europe. You've probably seen some of this Japan lacquerware, typically a black background with colors, sometimes a lot of gold lame work in it. They were importing it to Europe. It was very popular over there. But then the Europeans decided they'd figure out a way to do it themselves. The artists there recreated the process. Imports kind of died off and they were doing their own Japanning of woodwork, of artist type work or furniture. That eventually just kind of fell out of favor. But by that point, a lot of iron tools had showed up and they were looking for ways to prevent rust on these iron tools and iron hardware, homeware, like bed frames and things like that. And somebody experimented around with applying this boiled linseed oil type finish with asphaltum to the cast iron and found it adhered well and protected it really well from rust. So it became very popular to Japan cast iron products in the 17th century. It started in Italy originally and then became very popular in England. There's a location in England you may have heard of called Pontypool. It's actually in Wales, sorry. Not a geography expert. Pontypool did a lot of Japanning over there, and there is a product out there, a Japan commercially available Japanning product called Old Pontypool, named after that you can buy and apply to your hardware. So we'll talk about that later. I got a lot of information from Ford Motor Company because Model Ts were Japanned. A lot of the early automobiles, that was the best paint technology there was Japanning. So they Japanned the metal parts and they Japanned the external woodwork on the original Model Ts. A few more folks joining us here. So a lot of information from restorers of antique automobiles about Japanning. Singer sewing machines, the old black Singer sewing machines were Japanned. So there's information about some of that as well. By the late 1920s, enamel paint technology had reached a point that it was pretty competitive with Japanning. It was a lot easier to commercially apply it. Curing Japanning in really large quantities can be dangerous. There were several explosions at the Stanley factory with Japanning ovens that exploded and killed employees over the years. So in really large quantities, it can be a little flammable. So, but you don't need to worry about it with one plane. But at any rate, enamel paint became much easier and less expensive. And so Japanning fell by the wayside. By 1930, 1935, certainly by the war, World War II, most things were being enameled instead of Japan. So, going to talk just briefly before we get into the supplies here about the difference between historically correct hand plane Japanning and restoring the Japanning on a hand plane. These hand planes, when they were originally Japan, here's a raw plane right here. They were completely immersed. They were dunked in a tank of Japaning and then allowed to drip until most of the Japaning had run off. And then they were put into large walk-in ovens and heat cured at about 400 degrees. Generally, they were gas-fired or coal-fired ovens, which explains the explosions that took place in those ovens. But they were completely immersed as a raw casting, and then they were machined after that. The sole and the cheeks would have had Japaning on it from the immersion. That was all machined off. The interior surfaces where it was machined, the Japaning was removed in the machining process. That's not possible to restore a plane that way, unless you're going to remachine one. So that's the difference between restoring the Japaning and the original Japaning process is you're going to apply it with a brush on only the areas that you want Japanned. So, but otherwise, the formulations, as far as I've been able to determine from information, is pretty much the same. Japaning was not a trade secret, although companies didn't really publish their exact formulas. I have found a few out there, but none from Stanley or the plane manufacturers, but enough information to know that they all use pretty much the same ingredients. So we'll talk about those ingredients. Before we do that, I want to tell you about the 3 challenges that I think are the most difficult challenges to getting started Japaning planes. One is prepping the plane. It is a bit laborious to remove the old Japaning or enamel or whatever is on your plane before you Japan it. That's probably the most work. I have a media blasting cabinet, and that is how I remove old Japaning or whatever from the planes. Happy to talk about that in a sidebar conversation, but it's very effective. I think it can be done without, I know it can be done without any risk to the plane, but it's a lot of equipment and it's not something most people are going to have. So I've got suggestions on other ways to remove the Japaning. I have done a lot of experimenting with how to get Japaning off without a media blaster. So we'll talk about how you can do that. For some folks, getting the supplies for the Japaning can be a bit of a challenge. Asphaltum or gilsonite, which is a trade name for asphaltum, is readily available here in the States. It can be a little bit more difficult to find outside the US. It's mined pretty much worldwide. Today it's supplied mostly out of Iraq and Iran, but they still mine it here in the US. It's probably found on most of the continents, but it's just not a real popular product anymore. We'll talk about some locations, places you can look for it, other ways you can acquire it. I do ship Japaning. I have shipped it, or not Japaning, asphaltum. I've shipped it internationally. It's not any kind of a dangerous substance, so it can certainly be shipped anywhere in the world. So if you have trouble finding it, I might be able to help you with that. The solvents can be difficult to find, particularly in California. I think there's now 9 states that have adopted a lot of the Southern California air quality rules that have banned a lot of the pretty popular and traditional solvents that have high volatile compounds like turpentine, mineral spirits, things like that. There's substitutes available. They're sold in almost exactly the same containers, but it says turpentine substitute in small letters. I have not experimented with these substitute solvents yet. Simply because I haven't had anybody ship me any out of California. It's not available here. So I don't know how effective they are, but I do know some folks in California that have experimented with Japaning, did have some trouble finding it, but they went to adjacent states and acquired what they needed. So that may be a challenge for you. Lastly, the curing oven. I probably get more questions about what kind of an oven to use or how to heat cure the Japaning, or do I have to heat cure it than any other subject on Japaning? I will tell you that this course, this instruction is all about heat curing Japaning. I have played around with this in a lot of different ways, different formulas, cold cure, Japan dryers, all this kind of stuff. And I can tell you your best chance of success is to heat cure Japaning. And I can give you some tips on how to do that. And we'll talk about that in supplies. So before we jump into supplies, are there any questions out there? Don't forget you're muted, so unmute yourself. I think I saw Michael Laffey. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Yes, I have 2 questions actually. One, is there a year after which Stanley planes switched from lacquer to enamel?
It hasn't been ascertained exactly when they might have gone from a Japan finish to an enamel finish. But I believe World War II, that era is going to indicate when you're going to start seeing enamel. But as far as I know, no one has definitively ascertained when that date was.
How can you tell whether it's enamel or the lacquer?
Probably that's a really good question. If you have enough experience with it, you can tell by looking at it. But the thickness of the Japanning is going to be about twice as thick as the enamels on there. But I don't have a real easy way for you to determine that. Solubility, how easily is it dissolved in paint thinner, but paint thinner will also dissolve Japanning. So I don't have a real easy way for you to tell, other than I would say looking at the thickness, and you're going to have to compare a known enameled plane to a known Japan plane.
That's what I was going to ask, Greg. How would one go about knowing that the tool one is handling it used Japanning?
Yeah. We do. The only one we know for sure is Miller's Falls tools. Miller's Falls started producing hand planes in 1929, and they never Japanned their hand planes. They started with enamel when they started producing the bench planes. So, 1929 kind of becomes a date that you can look for other companies to start to transition.
How about other Miller's Falls tools? Because they were in business since like late 1800s.
Yeah. Prior to 1929, I suspect they were probably Japanning all their tools. You don't see enamel on commercial produced tools earlier than 1925. The technology really wasn't that good. So if there was anybody doing it, it would have been a very small tool maker.
So when you say enamel, you just mean enamel paint, right?
Yeah, enamel paint versus the Japan or lacquer. Yeah.
So my other question was, you talked about removing the medium. If you have just spots where it's missing, is it possible to do it without removing all the old stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I get that one a lot. And so a couple of months ago, I decided to give that a try and see if it was possible. And the short answer is yes, it is possible. The little longer answer is it's a very time consuming. It takes much longer than replacing the Japan finish of the plane. It's pretty tedious process, but you can do it. If you had maybe one or two dime-sized spots on a plane, that might be worth looking into. But if you've got more than maybe 10% loss of the Japanning, it's probably going to be faster and easier, and a more guaranteed successful outcome if you restore the entire Japanning surface.
I have a question.
Can be done. Yeah, Rafael.
So if one were to be thinking of just repairing the Japanning on a tool, the difference in finish is very remarkable, since like this plane here, I don't know if you can see it,
Mm-hmm.
but the finish is very glossy as opposed to an old plane's Japanning.
Right.
Is there a way to restore the gloss on old Japan, or that's not likely?
Yeah.
Not feasible?
I have not tried to restore the gloss on an old Japan plane. Some of what you see is, wear and tear of, dust accumulation being wiped off. So it's like, fine scratches in the surface. Cleaning it thoroughly with, without a solvent is going to help bring some of that gloss back. But if you go to just spot repair the plane, you can dull down what is the original Japan finish. Japanning is a glossy finish in its nature with the linseed oil. But you dull that down with like 5,000 grit sandpaper is what I did to match the finish of the rest of the plane that I spot restored when I was doing that experiment. And the match came out very, very good in the finish. So it is possible to dull down the replacement Japanning to look like the old Japanning. But again, the process of spot repairing Japanning is very time consuming. Even though Japanning is really good at self-leveling, it doesn't just fill in the missing area of Japanning. it's going to encounter that existing Japanning and form kind of a rim right there. And you're going to have to sand it down to get it flat. It's just a lot of work, but it can be done. So.
Question, Greg.
Yeah.
Longevity of Japanning, normal wear and tear. What's the average lifespan of it?
Well, that's a good question. Most of the antique planes that folks encounter today in the wild that we see circulated, most of them you got pretty good abuse and a lot of use. And so, most of those planes you see quite a bit of Japanning loss. A lot of them have been badly weathered, where you have a nick in the Japanning, a small scratch, moisture gets in there and rust starts to form under the Japanning and the Japanning turns loose. But I did a lot of abrasion testing on Japanning as I was working on different formulations. This is one of the mini test bed planes. Let me make this bigger. I've got several test bed planes that I've done a lot of testing on Japanning. It looks like it's still in spotlight mode. But I did some abrasion testing to see what the various mixtures and formulations that were out there on the internet and how well they held up. And I can tell you that the bond between Japanning and cast iron is much stronger than the enamel paint and cast iron.
Yeah.
I would say that a plane that you restore today that's going to be pretty well cared for, because the folks that are restoring planes take really good care of their tools. That Japanning is going to last much, much longer than the rest of your lifespan and probably your kids' lifespan. So under proper care, the Japanning will last indefinitely. So
what's the care on it? You mean just the usage?
Well, yeah, just regular usage. If you throw it in a toolbox and throw your wrenches in on top of your plane, then you're going to then you're going to chip it. And once you chip it, you're going to get moisture under it. But as long as you keep it in a plain till, it'll last forever.
Okay.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah, Greg.
Yeah. First, I can't find the little raise your hand button on my screen, so I just came.
Waving works fine.
Thanks. What are your thoughts on the decision to restore a hand plane? I've got those from my grandfather's toolbox, and they're in reasonably good condition. And I don't think that any of them have some super value to them in the sense of cost. If I was to sell them to somebody, I don't ever intend to.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first off, I don't want to get too deep in this discussion because this is a kind of like, what's the best way to sharpen question. There's, everybody has an opinion on it and they're all entitled to it. But as far as restoring, I think it's absolutely a personal choice what you want to do with your plane and how you want it to look. Personally, I was raised to take extremely good care of the tools. If you used a shovel, you scrubbed it down after you used it, and then you oiled it before you put it away, and it always looked like a brand new shovel. So my tools, the hand planes that I acquire, the vast majority of them, I restore them to a like new, or in some cases, what I consider to be better than new finish. But it is an absolutely personal choice. Even a plane that's missing 80–90% of its Japanning, if it's owned by an enthusiast and kept in a plane till and kept oiled or whatever you want to use to prevent rust, it'll survive forever in that condition. It doesn't have to be restored. But so I would say in the end, restore it to a level that makes you happy, that you like the look of your tool, that your tool inspires you, that you feel good about your tool. And whatever that level is to you, that's where you should do with your tools. So. All right, any other questions before we get into talking about supplies? Yes, David, I see David raising his hand. You'll have to unmute David.
Oh, there you go. On the Japanning, isn't if you braid it a little bit that it comes off in a brownish color?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, asphaltum is brown in its nature. I don't know if you can see this, but we'll look at it more when we get into the supplies here. But ground asphaltum is brown. It's used by artists yet today. You can buy asphaltum from artist supply stores. It's one of the pigments that they mix in with linseed oil and turpentine. They mix the exact same ingredients to make oil paints. Some artists make their own paints using various pigments, and Japanning or asphaltum is used for the browns, ochres, and black. So it's a matter of how much of the pigment you put in there to get to the black. When you apply it to the planes, the first coat you put on, I tend to refer to as a brown coat because it won't be very black. It'll be more brown on the first coat.
I was just figuring that would be a good way to judge if it was an enamel or a Japan plane.
Yeah. Now, once you get, of course, an original plane, when they were immersed in the Japaning, it's absolutely black. It's a very inky black when it's new. Once it, gets some surface wear and you lose that gloss, obviously, it doesn't have the depth that you see in brand new Japaning. But new Japaning looks like a black pool of ink you could fall into. So, yeah. All right. Any other questions before we talk about supplies? All right. Well, let's do that. Let me see if I can get my screen to look like your screen. I think. Okay. Where was I here? So we talked a little about some of the struggles you might have finding supplies. Now, I emailed out to everybody a copy of the curriculum and a supplies list. And what I'm going to talk about should follow that email I sent you as well. I'm hopefully that the email that I sent you had links to some of these supplies in there. That was my intention. I don't know if their links work or not. So let's start with turpentine. Really any solvent, petroleum-based solvent or petroleum-capable solvent, I guess may be a better phrase, can be used for Japaning. But turpentine was far and away the most common material used in Japaning. Naphtha was also used. I've come across that in some of the old texts on Japaning, and I have played around with naphtha-based Japaning. It's not superior to turpentine. It is a little bit slower to dissolve the asphaltum. It does tend to cure maybe a little bit quicker, but not enough that it's any advantage to using naphtha. So turpentine is the tried and true. Of course, a lot of the turpentine today is petroleum distillate, not actually harvested from pine trees and boiled down. But you can still get that. Artist stores sell what is known as gum turpentine, which is still harvested from trees. And it doesn't really seem to make any difference, to be honest with you. You can use either one. I just use big box store turpentine. It works just fine. Again, in some states, keep in mind what you're actually going to get is a turpentine substitute because of the bans on volatile organic compounds. I can't tell you how well that's going to work. I haven't gotten any feedback from anybody in a state that that's all they could acquire, and I have not been able to acquire any and fool around with it. But just plain turpentine is, and that's the easiest thing to find, obviously, for most folks. Boiled linseed oil, again, it doesn't have to be anything special. This is big box store boiled linseed oil. Been doing this for years. It works just fine. A little bit on linseed oil. I don't want to get too much into it because I am not really a world expert in linseed oil, but you have linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, and double boiled linseed oil. And my understanding is boiled linseed oil is linseed oil that today has catalysts added to help it dry faster. I think traditionally it was linseed oil that was boiled, I don't know, and that somehow helped it cure more quickly. But boiled linseed oil that you buy today has additives to it that help it cure a little bit more quickly, but it works just fine for Japaning. Double boiled linseed oil is a little bit of a non-standard in the industry. I have found that it can run the gamut. It can be anything from boiled linseed oil that has no catalyst added to it, so it's more of a traditional linseed oil that was boiled, to a linseed oil that has had twice as much catalyst added to it to cure even faster than boiled linseed oil. So double boiled linseed oil, read the label. If you want to experiment with it, I can't tell you how it's going to perform, but definitely read the label so you know what you're getting, because it may have even more catalysts that could accelerate curing. I don't think it's going to make a big difference in the Japaning, because what we're really dealing with Japaning is the slow cooking off of the turpentine for the cure. So again, I've had no issues with just using big box turpentine. Asphaltum is a little bit more difficult to acquire. Here in the States, there's a couple sources. There's a gentleman out of Colorado who sells gilsonite. which is from the Gilsonite mine company in Utah, where they still mine asphaltum today. Aside from artists using asphaltum, it is used in printing ink, primarily by newspapers. It's the black colorant in newspaper ink. And so the newspaper printing presses will consume very large quantities of very finely ground gilsonite. But he sells it on eBay. Yeah, I think it ends up costing you about $20 to $25, maybe $30, including shipping for a pound of gilsonite, which is a container this size. This is from that gentleman. You can search eBay for gilsonite or asphaltum and he'll come up. He's about the only seller out there. He sells smaller quantities. A pound of gilsonite will last you a lifetime. It is an enormous amount of gilsonite. So it's available in smaller quantities from Renaissance Graphics. They're an art supply store. And I have found other art supply store, including one in Canada, that sells powdered asphaltum or gilsonite. I tend to use the terms interchangeably. Internationally, I'm sure it's available. I have looked at companies in, I think it's Iraq, that sell it, because actually I'm going through far more than a pound at a time. So it is available in other countries, but I can't tell you specifically if your country has a resource for it. But because it's an inert powder, it is possible to ship it anywhere in the world. It's not a problem to ship it. So if you can't find it, you can contact me. I can probably ship it to you if the eBay seller doesn't. But at any rate, there's a couple sources for getting the gilsonite or asphaltum. You'll read articles about using roofing tar or other materials that have asphaltum in them. I have not played around with that at all. So I can't tell you how that's going to work out for you. I can tell you that getting the Japan mixture that's not too watery is one of the bigger challenges in mixing it. So if you start with any kind of a liquid asphaltum, I think you're going to find it more challenging to get the consistency that you want in the product that you're going to apply to your plane. I do make much smaller quantities of gilsonite available on my website if you want to buy a small quantity. It's really designed to mix a 1/4 ounce of Japani in a little container like this. I put it in the container and give you the container, so you've got a container to keep it in. That much Japani will do at least half a dozen size 4 planes. It probably would do 20 or 25. That's actually quite a bit of Japaning if you mix that up. It keeps indefinitely, so you don't need to worry about it as long as you keep it sealed. Brushes. Don't skimp on brushes. Get a good brush. You don't want to be fighting brush strokes, even though asphaltum self-levels, and it does a really good job of self-leveling. I initially tried applying this with a cheap chemical brush, you know, the thing you get in a pack of 100 from Harbor Freight for $5. And not only were bristles coming off into Japaning, and that's a nightmare, but it just did not apply it very evenly, and it didn't allow me to apply it in kind of some of the tight corners and tight spaces. So you can get these artist supply brushes. They're not particularly expensive off of Amazon or local art supply store. These are synthetic bristles. Tacklon is one of those synthetic bristle types that seems to work very well. If you're going to do any block planes, I suggest you get something that's got a very small brush in it, because there are some really tight areas that you're going to brush on a block plane. But otherwise, 1/2 inch wide is fine for most bench planes. But you can wash them out in turpentine. They'll last forever. I've been using these brushes for probably almost 2 years now. And I still use them every day. So spend a few dollars. They're not expensive, and you're good to go. Obviously, you need some containers for the turpentine, for disposing of used turpentine, rags, paper towels. I recommend using some plastic gloves, latex, nitrile, particularly once you start Japaning your plane. You don't really want to get the oils of your hands on the plane while you're holding it and applying the Japaning, because that can cause the Japaning to not adhere as well. I use acetone to wipe my planes down just before I start applying the Japaning, just to make sure I haven't left any oils on the plane from my hands or from my shop. I'm constantly applying rust preventatives to some of my tools, and I don't know if some of that may have gotten on a plane. So I wipe them down with acetone before I Japan them. As far as prepping your plane, some single edge razor blades, blunted chisels, not your fine chisels, are useful for scraping Japanning off. Small wire brushes, brass brushes are helpful in removing old Japanning. You'll need some measuring spoons if you're going to mix your own Japanning, a way to relatively accurately measure your ingredients. I pilfered a set of stainless steel measuring spoons out of the kitchen, and they work great. All you need is a tablespoon, or really a teaspoon. Teaspoon measure is probably the best because you're going to be working with relatively small quantities. And that's about all you need is you'll measure everything by teaspoons, or if you're European cc's. Something to stir the Japanning with. Little stir stick works fine. I use a little wire whisk, little miniature whisk, but it doesn't matter, whatever you got to stir it with. And a curing oven. So we'll talk a little bit about curing Japanning and a curing oven. If you've done any research on Japanning, you've come across this, Japan dryer. You can find this at Home Depot. It is what it says it is. It is a catalyst that was designed to accelerate the drying of oil-based paints. And it was used in traditional Japanning, but not for Japanning cast iron. It was used primarily when they were Japanning wood. A good example is the early Ford Model Ts had a lot of exterior wood that was Japanned. And you can't heat cure the wood because the heat curing temperature is high enough that it would scorch the wood. So they use Japan dryers to cause the Japanning to cure on the wood. I have done this. I have Japanned a number of wood items around the house. I have a historic home. And so a lot of the wood is Japanned, and I've restored it. And this works fine for wood because when you're applying Japanning to wood, you're kind of curing from both sides of the Japanning. The wood is absorbing the turpentine as well as the turpentine outgassing. And so you're kind of curing from both sides. I did try, I experimented quite a bit with, can you use Japan dryer to Japan a cast iron hand plane and avoid having to heat cure it? And to date, the answer is no. The Japanning will blister. I've tried this on a number of occasions and just not been successful. The catalyst causes the Japanning to skin over more rapidly when you add it to the Japan mixture. And once that skin forms, the remaining turpentine has a hard time outgassing from underneath the Japanning. And so it starts to form pockets. It starts to form little blisters where that VOC is trying to escape. And you end up with a very wrinkled finish on your plane. So that's the story on Japan dryer from my experience. If you want a Japan wood, I'll be happy to talk to you on how to do it, but I don't recommend doing it on cast iron. So back to the oven. I recommend using an electric oven. I have heat cured Japanning before I built a larger electric oven. I did a number 7 plane and I cured it in the gas oven in the house. So that raises a number of questions. First of all, it didn't catch on fire and burn down the house. You're not going to have that problem when you're doing one plane. If you filled your oven with hand planes on multiple racks on a gas oven, I would say that you could have a problem. As far as fumes, I get this question all the time. Can you cure it in the house? How's it smell? It smells like you have a quart canister of turpentine sitting on the kitchen counter and you left the lid off for a couple hours. The whole time it's in the oven, it smells like turpentine. It's not enough to run you out of the house. My wife's pretty sensitive to odors and she really didn't even notice it. So it can be done. But again, you've got turpentine in kind of a confined space. So use precautions so you don't want to be breathing the vapors, but it can be done. I did find when using a gas oven, combustion of natural gas tends to produce moisture. So I ended up with a very nicely Japanned plane that now had a fresh coating of rust on all the exterior surfaces that weren't Japanned. I had already stripped it of rust, so I ended up having to go back and remove the rust a second time. It was a flash rust. It came off relatively easy, but it is one of the potential hazards of using gas to cure a Japan plane, is you might put rust on your plane. So it just creates work. So I recommend electric. This little Black & Decker toaster oven that I provided a link to is exactly what I used to cure planes. It's what I used, 2 of them, to build a larger oven that will hold larger planes. This little Black & Decker oven will accommodate a number 6 Stanley. If you put it in there diagonally, it's fairly deep, but that's the largest plane that will fit in there. So if you want to do larger planes, you're going to have to come up with a solution. I have built a larger Japanning oven. I have an instruction manual on my website. If you want to tackle that project, it's not overly difficult. If you can operate a pair of tin snips and some pliers and screwdrivers, you can probably do it. I have helped others do it successfully. So if you really get into this and you want to tackle bigger planes, you can buy 2 of these ovens and make 1 large oven out of them. It's not that difficult. So lastly, just a quick safety tip, particularly with boiled linseed oil. If you're not aware, a lot of these solvents, particularly boiled linseed oil, are famous for spontaneous combustion. If you get rags soaked in mineral spirits or boiled linseed oil, if you don't know this, a lot of wood stains, and you throw those rags in the trash, they can self-ignite. As that linseed oil is curing, it generates heat, and it will catch on fire. You can find videos on YouTube of people demonstrating this. James Wright, Wood by Wright, demonstrated this in his fire pit. The neighbor behind me demonstrated this on his back patio in his trash bin when he set his house on fire. The house was being worked on. They'd done a bunch of staining. They threw all the rags in the big commercial trash can that your dumpster, your trash company picks up. And later that afternoon, it caught fire, caught the fence on fire, caught the house on fire. And I posted that video as well. So it's a real deal. Follow the directions for handling any rag that's got linseed oil on it. Lay it out on a piece of concrete, let it dry, air dry completely before you dispose of it. So if you weren't aware of that, you are now. So a lot of information. Let's take a short break here and see if folks have questions.
I have a quick question. So I attempted to do Japanning recently. I just started my venture into this, and I posted a whole bunch of questions on the Facebook group chat, a Facebook group, and I know you helped me out quite a few times. One of the things, the end result of my Japanning is I started off having the Japanning fairly liquid, very the viscosity is very kind of like consistency of more like I would describe it is a little bit thinner than honey. And then now after about like a month now, or a month and a half since I did that, it got to a consistency of more thicker than molasses.
Okay.
And what is the process? Do I need to thin that out in order for me to use it again? Or what I did notice is that I store it in my basement. My basement right now is approximately 50 degrees. So when I bring it upstairs, it does does become a little bit thinner, but not to a point where I can easily apply it. And I do have a pellet stove, so when I put it in front of the pellet stove, it does loosen it to a point where it's applicable, but I don't really want to half cure it before I even apply it.
Yep. So yeah, the Japanning will thicken maybe in the first week or so. Has been my experience that you mix it. I think that you still have some chemistry going on there, or some of the asphaltum that didn't dissolve is still dissolving, and it will thicken a little bit in the first week. Check your container, make sure it was airtight. But the solution to the issue is you can absolutely add more turpentine to it and get it back to the consistency you want. That's not a problem at all. Definitely be cognizant of the temperature. When we get into applying Japanning, I'm going to tell you, you want it to be in at least a 72-degree room when you apply it. I have applied it out here in my shop when I didn't have the heater on. It was probably 68, and it didn't self-level well. I got a very lumpy finish. I stripped the plane and started over, learned from my mistake. So, So if you can apply it in a room that's warmer, as you found, you can warm it a little bit. Obviously, you don't want to get it much above about 80, 90 degrees. I did put some Japani in the oven one time to warm it up, and it thickened quite a bit in about half an hour because I cured it in the can. Yeah. So, but yeah, you can warm it up. I have warmed up a plain body before when my heater was out of commission. I put the plain body in the oven, warmed it up, to probably 80, 90 degrees. It's comfortable to hold. Actually felt nice in my hand. And as long as you worked to where you had the Japani applied with maybe another 20 minutes to go so that it could self-level before the plane got too cool, that worked as well. But yeah, if it's thicker than you want, absolutely add turpentine. That's the easiest thing to do. If you didn't filter your Japani mixture, you will have undissolved material. It's typically referred to as ash in the industry. That's part of the refining process on the bottom of your container. So when you stir in the turpentine, you're going to stir that back up, and you're going to want to let it sit for several days so that settles out of your mix into the bottom of your can.
Okay.
You're better off to be a little thick sometimes than too thin in the Japani. If you have to add asphaltum back to your Japani, that's a longer process. It's very slow to dissolve once you've added the BLO and everything else. Your concentration of turpentine is lower, and the adding Japani powder to a mixture takes a week to dissolve, and you've added a lot of particulate matter. So if you're a little thick and you thin it with some turpentine, it's a great way to go.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, Raphael.
Turpentine that you buy from the hardware store, it's not possible to know that it's real gum turpentine or it's a synthetic version, right?
You pretty much be assured that it is not real gum turpentine. Real gum turpentine is more expensive. It's not a commercially viable way to produce large quantities. So the stuff you're going to find in the big box stores is going to be, I believe, a fractured petroleum product. But it works fine. It works absolutely fine. If you want to get, if your heart's set on being very, very traditional in your mix, you can get gum turpentine through artist supply houses and work with that in a traditional linseed oil, and it works as well. So
when you use, and you're saying that if you use a gas oven, it probably will rust your tools in.
Mine did, but I have also spoken with somebody who has also cured a plane in a gas oven, and they didn't experience that. So it might also be that I'm in a relatively humid area in Northern Virginia, and it was in the summer when it was quite humid. So that might have been one of the factors. I only did it that one time. And again, it's a surface rust. It came off with a Scotch-Brite pad. I just, buffed it off. It wasn't a big issue. So. And
regarding the fumes, would the oven be left with a smell of turpentine afterwards?
No, it was our it was our very expensive house oven that I cured the plane in, and we still have it. I still bake cookies in it today. So no, the fumes go away right away. I mean, as soon as
I don't think my wife would let me use the kitchen. She'll kill me.
No, I definitely recommend getting a little toaster oven. The toaster ovens are not very expensive, unless you're going to do planes larger than 18 inches and you need a bigger oven. Then we can probably find ways around that.
Last, before I forget, the little prepared Japani that you said in your website, is that ready to go, or does it need to be thinned?
It should be ready to go. That is the same mixture I use. I mix it up generally a quart or two at a time, and I pour some in a little. This is my little working container right here. So I keep some in my little working container. I pour the rest off into other little containers, and if people want to buy some, I put a label on it and ship it out to them. I don't ship the actual Japani internationally because of the turpentine. I haven't looked into all the international restrictions on shipping of a flammable material. The powdered gilsonite can ship it anywhere. The actual Japani I've only shipped in the U.S., but it should be ready to go.
How about colors to make like a red, or are you gonna touch on that later, or?
A little bit, but I can tell you, unless you're really adventurous, I wouldn't recommend it. It is proving to be very difficult. Asphaltum, as a petroleum product, it's basically petrified crude oil. It dissolves in the turpentine. All the other coloring agents, that even the reds that were used, the red Ohio, I'm pretty sure was vermilion that was added, which is a very common red pigment. They are not soluble in turpentine. So you're now working with a suspension of coloring agents. And I have messed with quite a few of these coloring agents. Even though they're ground to a very fine powder, they act very differently in the Japanning. It is much, much more difficult to work with, and it does not bond as well. The Ohio planes, the red Japan planes, if you're familiar with them, you'll know that the Japanning it's very rare to find one that's in decent condition, because once you add those suspension of particles to it, it does not bond as well to the cast iron. In fact, Ohio, it looks like Japan may have Japanned the planes black before they put the red over it, probably in an attempt to get a better bond. So,
how about ochre?
I have not tried ochre yet, but I have tried over half a dozen different coloring agents. I am waiting to get some vermilion. Currently, it seems to be back ordered worldwide, unless you want to pay the price of gold for it. I mean, it can be outrageously expensive. But I do want to continue to experiment, because I am trying to duplicate the Ohio red. But yeah, if you're going to play with other pigments, recognize you're definitely going to be experimenting quite a bit. So.
Cool, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
Can you elaborate a little bit on filtering your mixture after you're done?
Sure. Well, actually, we'll get into that next week when we talk about actually mixing the Japanning.
That's okay then.
Yep. And I've got I did put a video on YouTube. Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel. There's like 3 videos on it, but I kept getting questions about filtering, so I videoed some filtering and put it on there. But
okay.
we'll walk through it. Yeah, and we'll walk through it. It's I definitely recommend it. I think it's a great way to go. So
I didn't realize it.
Yeah, I'm impatient, so it allows you to get started quicker. Any other questions? I think I saw one other person maybe. No? Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about preparing a plane, doing plane prep. Hopefully you guys all have a target plane, one that you're planning on being your first Japan plane. You're not going to damage the plane, so it doesn't matter. You don't have to pick one that's a junker. But certainly if you want to experiment around on one that if you've got one that's in bad shape that you want to experiment with and you don't want to strip it down a second time, that's fine. But you can't do any harm, so don't worry about that. Japanning block planes, it looks like a great way to start. Let me spotlight this video again, sorry. Because they're small. So, but they are a little bit more difficult. If you look at it, there's a number of objects that are japanned on both sides. So now you're doing one side, curing, getting all the way through it, doing the other side, all that kind of stuff. A lot of small parts, a lot of little small delicate areas to Japan. So a little bit more tedious, but certainly doable and very enjoyable to refinish these little block planes. So, but bench planes are simpler to do. There's fewer areas that were machined, and they're a little easier to get your brush around. So certainly the classic number 4 bench plane is a great place to start, but it doesn't really matter. Make sure that your plane is going to fit in whatever you're going to use for a curing oven. So that's a lesson in experience there. I didn't originally plan on putting the number 7 plane in the oven in the house. I japanned it, went to put it in my oven and realized it didn't fit. So then it went to the house and got cured. So make sure it'll fit where you're going to japan it. Does the frog require japanning? They're japanned, but usually the frogs are kind of protected in where they sit in the plane. So it's not uncommon to find that the bed of your plane may be in pretty bad shape, but the frog may be fine. So you don't necessarily need to japan it. Totally up to you. It probably will not be quite as glossy as the rest of the plane, just from age of the japanning. But you know, the frog is a little bit more tedious. So if you don't have to japan it, that's great. So I think the first thing in prepping your plane or in restoring a plane is to make sure you know what it is you want to achieve at the end, right? What's your goal for your plane? Somebody just joined us here. I'll let them in. Document your plane before you start stripping it. Take some pictures of it. Take some good pictures of your plane before you start stripping it down. And the reason for that is once you strip it down and you have your Japanning and your brush and you get ready to start applying the brush, the first thing that's going to come to mind is, oh, what surfaces had Japanning and what didn't? You're not going to remember. Were the cheek rails Japanned on this plane? What part of the frog bed had Japanning, what part didn't? Was it Japanned under the tote? So it's really nice to have that documented so you know if you're going to try to recreate the look of the plane, you know exactly where you want to put the Japanning. So again, that's the voice of experience. Make sure you have a storage container for all the parts of your plane. If you're going to do multiple planes, it is so easy to intermix parts. And now you've got a couple of Franken planes that you're trying to sort out. I think that's where a lot of Franken planes come from today. If you're not familiar with the term, a plane that is a Frankenstein composed of lots of other parts. I think sometimes you've got folks out there that are, that find planes in the field and sell them. I'm thankful for these folks. That's where I get a lot of my planes. But I think sometimes they may be taking them all apart and kind of cleaning them up and they don't get the parts back with the right plane. So have a container to keep the parts for the plane you're working on. So removing the existing finish. If you're going to media blast, and I doubt many of you are, protect the threaded areas of the plane. This one here is one that's been media blasted. You see I've just got some little pieces of rolled up tape stuffed in the holes where the threads go. You're not going to damage the threads with the media, but the media tends to cling to those threads. It's difficult to get it back out. And if you start screwing a post in there with any blasting media left, now you could be creating a problem. So protect the threads if you're using media blasting. If you're not using media blasting, there's no reason to worry about it. Probably the most common way for folks to strip hand planes down of the original Japanning that I've encountered is to use a Dremel tool with some small wire wheels on the Dremel. Works pretty well. I would recommend that you definitely wear eye protection. The Japanning tends to come off in flakes, and that Dremel tool will throw them around, so it'll throw them in your eyes. So wear eye protection if you're going to use a Dremel. Get an assortment of the little brushes. You'll probably go through 2 or 3 doing a number 4 plane with a Dremel. But it goes through the Japanning pretty quick. Most of the Japanning on the plane you're going to restore is probably looser than you realize. There's probably some rust underneath it. So a lot of it will come off pretty quick. It's very unlikely that you will damage the cast iron with a Dremel and a small wire brush unless you put that wire brush in one spot on high speed and just stay there until you basically wear out the brush. Then you'll actually wear some of the cast iron. But if you're just focused on removing the Japanning, it's a very safe way to go. I have read about people saying don't use wire wheels on a plane, it'll damage the metal. So what did I do? I experimented. I took one of these planes. It's a broken body. I took it over to my bench grinder. I took it to a higher speed grinder than my bench grinder, put an 8-inch wire wheel on it, stuck the cheek of the plane at the thinnest point into that wire wheel and held it there until I finally could see it damaging the cheek. It took about 90 seconds. So you've got to really be trying to damage your plane if you're going to damage it with a wire wheel. So, but the Dremel works pretty well. And a lot of people use it to remove the Japanning. You can also remove the Japanning with solvents. I have tried a number of different solvents. The most effective one that I have found is lacquer thinner. Again, if you're in California and you're getting lacquer thinner substitute, that may not be as effective. I don't know how well that'll work, but genuine lacquer thinner from the big box stores will soften the Japanning in just a few hours. Overnight, the Japanning will almost just be a goo that you can wipe off. So if you soak it in lacquer thinner overnight, it's gonna just about come off with a plastic scraper. Make sure that if you do that, you have it in a sealed container or you put it somewhere where ventilated, because you're gonna have a pretty sizable quantity of lacquer thinner exposed, and you're gonna produce a lot of vapors from the lacquer thinner, which not good to breathe, could be flammable. A number of ways to do that. Here's a couple of methods that I've used. This is a plastic shoebox with a lid. It's not an airtight lid, but it's tight enough that it prevented any real fumes. It smelled like the shop, wasn't a big deal. Put the plane in there on its side, soaked it overnight, or actually I think I soaked it for the day in lacquer thinner, and it was quite effective, and it was a pretty easy way to get the Japanning off. If you're doing a larger plane, you can get a piece of PVC, cap off one end of it, drop your plane in here, and add the lacquer thinner. The advantage here is it may not take quite as much lacquer thinner if you use a smaller piece of PVC that fits your plane, but you're probably going to be using a gallon of lacquer thinner to soak a plane and do it that way, either way. But that's a great way to go. I have read about soaking planes in evaporust, that it takes your Japanning off. And so I experimented with that, and yes, it will if you leave it in there for at least 6 days. After 6 days, the Japanning is starting to come loose. If you put your plane in evaporust overnight, your Japanning is probably going to be fine, but you will find that there is rust in areas you didn't know, and the evaporust is going to separate that rust from the metal, and the overlying Japanning is going to come off as well. So I think that's why people think evaporust strips Japanning, is that it's loose Japanning that's sitting over a rusted area and it comes loose. So I've read where people recommend using simple green to remove the Japanning. I soaked a plane for 3 days in simple green, and I ended up with a really clean plane with really good Japanning still stuck to it. So I didn't find that had any effect. I have used turpentine. Soaked a plane in turpentine to remove the Japanning. That was the first chemical I tried. Since it's part of what Japanning is made of, I figured, well, it's going to be absolutely harmless. It won't create any problem with the Japanning I add to it later if it soaks into the cast iron. And it works, but it's pretty slow. It took about 3 days of soaking before the Japanning was mostly loose. Probably got 90% of it off, and I cleaned up the rest with a Dremel. I think the, not acetone, sorry, the lacquer thinner is the way to go if you're going to use a solvent to remove the Japanning. It has no adverse effect on the cast iron. It's relatively quick. It's relatively inexpensive. It's relatively smelly. So, use good ventilation. I recommend that you do whatever cleanup you're going to do to the machined surfaces of the plane before you start the Japanning process. The sole, the cheeks, get most of that work done before you Japan it. The reason I recommend that is if you're going to be, doing any kind of work, lapping, Scotch-Brite, whatever it is you're going to do to take rust off the sole or the cheek of your plane, and you've already Japanned it, you slip with your Scotch-Brite pad or whatever you're using when you're lapping, and you may damage your Japanning finish. And now you're either faced with stripping it all and redoing it, or trying to do a touch-up repair on Japanning, which I've said is very difficult. So I would get most of the rest of the plane in the condition you want it before you Japan. The Japanning process, you're not gonna adversely affect whatever finish you have on the sole or the cheeks of your plane when you go to do the Japanning process. So that would be the order that I would recommend. Let's see. That's pretty much it for Japanning. There's a lot of other things you can talk about in plane restoration. Happy to have that conversation, but at another time, because that can go on forever. I will tell you that there's a couple of good videos or people out there with information on, totally restoring a plane. If you want to be very aggressive and you want to take a plane and that may not be in very good condition and you want to turn it back into a user and you're not really concerned about traditional look, Mark Webster has some outstanding information. He is, I've hosted him on a weekly show that I do, and we recorded that. Those videos of Mark talking about his restoration process, where he shares every detail, are on the website, The Plane Life. Mark also has an Instagram account, mwebster61, where he posts all kinds of information about restoring planes. So you can go there. If you want to be very traditional, if you've got a collectible plane that you just want to clean it up, but you don't really want to change the appearance or really adversely affect the patina that you want to preserve, Rob Porter has done some videos on restoring hand planes with a very light touch. And if you search for Rob Porter on YouTube, I think you can find those. So that's where I would recommend looking for tips on restoring planes. So that's a lot of me talking. I see David's got a question, and I'm gonna stop talking and answer questions. Go ahead, David.
Do you put more than one coat of Japanning on a plane ever?
That's a great question. Yes, I do. I always do at least 2, almost always 3, occasionally 4. Reason for that is I'm going to try to give you really conservative ways to Japan a plane, ways that are going to negate possible areas of failure. If you put Japanning on very thick and you start to cure it, it will start to blister. It'll start, you'll get this very rough, blistered, wrinkly finish. Also, if you put it on very heavy, particularly because you're going to be doing vertical surfaces, it can start to sag, and you'll get what looks like a drip or a run in a regular paint job. You can also get it building up where it sags into the seams down here and have a bad outcome. So I do an initial very thin coat that I call a brown coat. This plane has got what I call a brown coat on it. It looks black on the camera, but maybe if I get close enough, you can see that it's still got kind of you can kind of see, particularly in the frog, you can see the cast iron through the Japanning. It's a very light coat. If you're here, standing here looking at it, you can see the cast iron through it. It looks kind of brown. That's the first coat. And then sometimes a second coat and you're done. Sometimes you'll do 3, just depends on how it's going. So, all right. And you cure between each coat. We'll talk about all that. That keep you out of trouble. So, okay. Sure. Any other questions?
Hey, Greg.
Yes, Michael. Or was that Michael?
No, it's Greg.
Okay, let's go with Greg, and then I'll come back to Michael. Go ahead, Greg.
Real quick. So when you paint it on real thin and then you go to cure it, does the brush strokes, do they end up smoothing out?
They do, yeah. Japanning, I think its most famous quality is its self-leveling ability. Even when it's thin like that, as long as you give it time to self-level, which we'll talk about when we cure, which is really only maybe 20 or 30 minutes before you start heating it. Yeah, the brush strokes will come out completely, and you'll be very happy with the finish. Yeah. So,
thanks.
Good question, Michael.
So, what happens if you put a new coat of Japanning over old Japanning?
It's an excellent question. That was the first time I tried to spot repair when I decided to see, can we fix Japanning? That was the first thing I did, was just I've got that plane here somewhere. I'd show you what it looks like. I just applied the Japanning over it to see if the self-leveling qualities would flow out and give me a good finish. It doesn't. It adheres just fine. It'll bond to the existing Japanning as long as it's clean. I recommend you clean it with turpentine before you Japan over it. With the turpentine, you'll actually get maybe a little bit of brown come off, as it might be removing some very surface loose Japanning, but it'll bond fine. But you'll clearly see the dimples wherever the Japanning was missing. So it'll protect it. It'll be black. It'll be good looking finish, but it'll still have the same visible flaws that you started with.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, sure.
What if you like the spot finish that you were doing? What if you stand it like you put the Japanning on and then let it self level, heat cure it, and then sand it smooth, and then apply an overall coat on top of that? Would that actually like make it like as if you didn't have, I mean, like you wouldn't see the difference? Would you still see the difference?
I think that you can absolutely repair the Japanning finish in exactly the way you described. That is the technique that I ended up with that gave me a very satisfactory finish when I was experimenting with spot repair. I applied the Japanning in the spot. First, you have to clean the spot. So that's a Dremel you know, cleaning those little areas, you know, so your plane looks like it has chicken pox, right? All the little spots. Applying the Japanning, you know, mostly in just the bare metal, but you're going to get a little bit of a rim up on the adjacent Japanning to seal it. Cured it, sanded it flat, second coat, cured it, sanded it back flat again. And again, using a very high grit sandpaper, ended up with a finish that looked very much like the original plane, kind of a dull Japan finish. So yeah, it can be done, absolutely. But it is more tedious. It is definitely more fraught with air. You know, you could sand through the existing Japanning. You know, you may not have gotten all the rust out. You know, so it's more difficult, but you could do it. Any other questions?
I have one, Greg.
Yes, Danny.
Between coats, is there any surface preparation for the existing coat so it adheres?
No, there isn't. Although you definitely want to keep the plane in a dust-free environment. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that when we talk about curing as well. Again, that's the lesson of experience. I Japanned a plane, set it aside for a week or so, went back to put it in the oven, had done some woodworking, ended up with a very nice textured finish in my Japanning. So, but yeah, the secondary coats of Japanning will adhere to the other coats very, very well. So, any other questions? All right. So again, I've set these up for about an hour. We ran a little bit longer here, but I don't want to do information overload. So the next session, we're going to mix Japanning. If you want to mix Japanning along with us, have your ingredients ready. I'm going to go over exactly how I mix it. That session, when we did this the first time, really didn't take very long. It was about 30 minutes. We'll talk about filtering. Maybe I'll actually filter some Japanning so you can see that. It is a bit of a mess, but I found some ways to do it that's not quite as messy. And why to filter, why not filter, what else can you do? You don't have to filter the Japanning. And then we'll have our Japanning ready to go. And then the third session, we'll talk about actually applying it to the planes. So if you haven't registered for session 2 and 3, they are a different Zoom link. I'm not a Zoom expert, but in setting this up, it creates a different link for each one. So definitely go and register for it. It should automatically send you the link to the next section. I'll do the same thing I did before this one. I'll email everybody the link just before to make sure they got it, because I don't trust the technology. I don't trust the software portion of the technology. I'm the software. If you are having trouble getting supplies, message me, contact me, let me know. I might be able to help you there. But I think that's about it. I didn't talk about this old Ponte pool, by the way. If any of you guys have done much research on Japan, you will find this product for sale. It's a company in New York that produces this. There are actually other commercially available Asphaltum products out there. I have obviously used this. It is incredibly thick material. It's you actually have to kind of spoon it out. You have to cut it out with a spoon. It's like Jello, way too thick to apply, but you can thin it and apply it. I don't know exactly what it's made of. They don't list the ingredients, but I have used it. I've used it. I've experimented with it on a plane. I have not Japanned a plane with it. I have Japanned other cast iron tools with it, and the finish looks good. I don't know about the durability. It's those things are undergoing durability testing now, but it's very expensive. I would say that's really the only downside. This is a quart. They only sell it in quarts. It's about $85 for a quart. That will last you a lifetime, particularly since you have to take it out of here, put it in a separate container, and thin it down enough to actually apply it. But that's a lot of Japanning, but it certainly seems to be a good product. I think it's probably the same ingredients. I think it would work fine. So that's one thing to consider. You'll also find Japanning or Asphaltum sold by jewelry companies, jewelry supply companies. They use it as a masking agent for some of the etching processes in jewelry. I've experimented with that, and I don't believe that is the same product. That product is very prone to wrinkling and heat curing. It looks great, but I don't recommend it because it is very, very sensitive. It's very easy for it to go wrong and then you're faced with stripping your plane again. But the Pontypool seems to be fine if you want to invest the money in Pontypool. That's one way to go if you don't want to mix your own. So that's about it. Any last questions before we go?
Yeah, I do have one before we go.
Yes.
You mentioned the sandblasting. May I ask what do you use for sandblasting?
What media? I use 80 grit glass bead.
Okay.
I actually work up to 40 to 60 PSI, but that's pretty high. I've been sandblasting for about 25 years. My cabinet, I've had it for decades. I can tell you Mark Webster, who is an outstanding restoration, hand plane restorer, uses media blasting, and he, I don't believe goes above 25 PSI, maybe 20 with glass bead media. He gets an outstanding surface finish from it, and it's just slower to remove the Japanning. He uses, I think, the same glass bead media. If he's working on a plane where the Japanning just is not coming loose, and you would ask, well, why are you removing it? Well, it's because it's come loose in other areas. He uses fractured glass at about 20 to 25 PSI. And that's a fractured glass, obviously, is an edged product, and it will take the Japanning off. So, but with the glass bead media working usually about 60 PSI, I find it removes the Japanning very quick without any damage. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, how is the new union process applying the Japanning?
Union initially was looking at some two-part enamel paints that they experimented with, but they are now have settled on powder coating of the planes. I've worked with Rob on this. He actually, I Japanned one of the XOA rejects for him to machine, because we were looking at, what's the machining effect on Japanning. He had one of them powder coated and showed me both of them in a picture. And if I had not been the one that had Japanned the plane, I would not have been able to tell the Japan plane from the powder coated plane. You get a very similar surface appearance in the way the Japanning kind of smooths out and blurs some definition on the surface. The powder coating looks extremely similar. It's definitely more commercially viable. So Union is going to be powder coating. I think that's a great choice for them. It's affordable, it's fast, it's very durable. So, yep. And I have not powder coated a plane. I used to have a powder coating system. I used to powder coat parts for cars that I built, but certainly I think it's a viable solution if you want to do it. I think it provides a really good finish. But,
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining. I hope I didn't bore you and talk your ears off. Make sure you register for session 2. Again, it's a different Zoom link. The system should send you that link. That one will probably be a lot shorter, although you may have more questions about mixing the Japanning. But hopefully after that, you'll be ready to mix, and you'll have your plane prepped. And by week 3, you'll be Japanning a hand plane. I will be Japanning a plane. I've got to pick one here to do, but I will Japan a plane on week 3 that you can watch me do it. So,
thank you, Greg.
Guys, have a great weekend.
You too.
Very interesting. Great. Thank you. See you next week.
Okay.
I did not get the link for next week.
You did not, David?
I don't think so. I'm taking a look.
Okay. I'll do the same thing I did before this meeting, but I'll do it earlier. This morning, I got a notice from somebody that didn't get the link. And so I went in there and got everybody's email address, and I emailed the link directly to everybody this morning for this session. I'll do that for session 2, but I'll do it the day before.
Okay.
So you should have multiple copies. Yeah. It seems like they can't quite trust the website to do it automatically.
Yeah.
Never trust a website.
Nope. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.